Is there hope?
All things are possible through him.
Welcome. You've tuned into what we're treating as a secure deep dive. Our mission today is to get past the surface narratives and really apply some forensic scrutiny to a very complex historical entity.
Exactly. So forget your standard history lesson. We're initiating an operation, and the source material for this analysis is a series of dossiers collectively labeled Operation Fall of Babylon.
And these sources, they target what they define as the Roman Catholic system. But, and this is key, they don't frame it as just a religious community.
Not at all. It's framed as a long-standing geopolitical, spiritual, and maybe most importantly, an intelligence entity.
The central claim we're looking at here is, well, it's massive. It's an assertion of a 1,600-year-old fusion.
Right. The merging of Imperial Rome's power structures, specific Babylonian mystery religion rites, and these really sophisticated subversive intelligence mechanisms.
All culminating in the global power structure that we see today. It's a bold claim, and our job here is to navigate these sources, as rigorously as we can.
And the sources have a name for this target. They call it the Ghost of the Roman Empire.
Arguing it sits directly on the grave of the original decentralized, free assembly of early believers, the ecclesia.
So we're really analyzing the evidence for engineered control versus that original freedom.
Okay, so we have to establish our framework right up front. The standard of measurement for judging these claims of, let's say, divergence or subversion. What is it?
It's strictly defined by the sources themselves. Exclusively the Koine Greek scriptures, so the New Covenant and the Septuagint, the LXX.
So we're tasked with rejecting any validation that comes from later church fathers or from tradition.
Exactly. The goal is to maintain a neutral analytical base for the argument the sources are making.
All right, that's clear. Let's unpack the structure then. We've got 4 phases of forensic data to work with. The sources lay it out as a kind of 4-front war.
Affirmative. Phase 1 is what they call the Imperial Mask. This is all about the form of Roman power, the titles, the rights that were adopted.
Okay, the external stuff.
Then Phase 2, the spiritual Ponzi Scheme. This gets into the internal mechanic, how, according to these sources, spiritual grace was turned into a commodity.
Centralized and controlled. Got it. What's Phase 3?
Phase 3 is the iron teeth. Here we're examining the force, the methods of enforcement, and, geopolitical dominance.
And finally, Phase 4.
The ghost in the machine. This is the deep intelligence dive, the claims of infiltration and subversive strategies right inside the leadership structure.
That's a very clear roadmap. Let's move straight into it. Phase 1, the Imperial Mask. The analysis here is focused on how these imperial structures were, for lack of a better word, baptized between the Edict of Milan in 313 and the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD.
A very rapid transformation.
The dossiers kick off with the title itself, the actual mantle of authority worn by the Bishop of Rome. For the sources, this is like Exhibit A.
It's the most blatant piece of evidence they present for this appropriation of imperial power.
And that title is Pontifex Maximus.
Pontifex Maximus, which translates to the Supreme Pontiff, or, a bit more literally, the chief bridge builder.
And the sources are, well, they're pretty blunt about this. They say it has zero to do with early Christianity.
Absolutely nothing. It is pure, ancient Roman paganism. It predates the birth of Christ by centuries.
So what did it actually mean in the Roman state? What was its function?
It was the highest office in Roman state religion. The Pontifex Maximus was the head of the College of Pontiffs, the main group of state priests.
And their job was?
Their fundamental task was maintaining the Pax Diorum, the peace with the gods. They oversaw everything, public and private religious life, just to make sure Rome stayed in good standing with its pantheon.
And this is where that power fusion happens, right? We're not just talking about some priest. Figures like Julius Caesar and Augustus held this title.
Exactly. It wasn't just a religious hat to wear. It was the very mechanism that fused religious authority with the political control of the emperor. It was the ultimate statement. The ruler controls the state and the spiritual realm.
So the sources track this, even through the early Christian emperors. Constantine kept the title, even after his supposed conversion.
He did. But the key moment, the real pivot point, according to these historical notes, happens between 376 and 383 AD.
With Emperor Gratian, a devout Christian who actually gave up the title.
He relinquished it. He rejected its pagan roots, its imperial baggage. He refused to wear the vestments or accept the authority that came with it.
And the sources allege that this mantle of power, once dropped by the emperor, didn't just disappear.
It was, they claim, swiftly picked up by the Bishop of Rome, Pope Damasus I. Now, it wasn't immediately used exclusively, but by the end of the 4th century, popes were using it to elevate their status.
Until it was formalized as an exclusive papal title under Gregory VII in the 11th century.
Right. And that's why the sources conclude this wasn't Christianization. They're very clear on this. It was a strategic appropriation.
Why is that distinction so important for their whole argument?
Because, they argue, it preserved the imperial framework, that top-down centralized religious control. Instead of the New Covenant model of, local elders and equality among believers, the title introduced what they call hierarchical inflation.
It turned the Bishop of Rome into a new kind of emperor.
A spiritual emperor,
Yeah.
the sole supreme authority. It was totally alien to the simple shepherd-elder model you find in the scriptures. The moment that title was accepted, the transformation was, in their view, functionally complete.
So the title provides the legal and political form. The next piece of the puzzle, according to the sources, is the spiritual component that made the transition easier for millions of pagans, the syncretic idol.
This section looks at the really rapid and, frankly, aggressive development of the cult of Mary.
And the focus is on how its titles and its iconography just happen to resonate perfectly with ancient mother goddess cults.
It facilitated mass conversion without actually requiring a total break from old devotional habits.
Okay, so what are the strongest parallels they point to, the visual echoes?
The Isis and Horus connection is a big one. Historically, Isis, the Egyptian goddess of fertility, of motherhood, was almost always depicted with her son, Horus.
Right, and you see her nursing him, and they both have halos, or sun discs.
The discs, exactly, symbolizing divine power. The sources argue that the early, pervasive iconography of Mary with the child, especially with the halo, is direct visual transfer, a rebranding.
And the title itself, the Queen of Heaven, where do they trace that back to?
All the way back through Babylonian and Assyrian mystery religions. It links to fertility goddesses like Ishtar, Astarte, or the figure of Semiramis, often paired with a sun god like Tammuz.
And this is where using the Septuagint as the standard becomes so critical. This isn't just a theological quibble for them. They say the Old Covenant scriptures explicitly condemn this practice by name.
Precisely. They point to Jeremiah chapter 7 and chapter 44 in the Septuagint. The worship of the Queen of Heaven in those passages, making cakes, pouring out offerings, is described as something that provoked God's intense wrath.
So from their perspective, adopting that title isn't a neutral act. It's incorporating an explicitly condemned pagan cult.
That's the argument. And politically, it was a brilliant move for the empire after 313 AD.
How so?
It was strategic. Marian devotion, especially with her as an intermediary, provided this powerful, venerable female figure. It appealed perfectly to pagan psychology, which was used to elevating goddesses. And you see this most clearly in places like Ephesus.
Ephesus, which was the former site of the gigantic temple of Artemis, the great mother goddess of the ancient world.
Correct. So when the Council of Ephesus convenes there in 431 AD and declares Mary Theotokos, God-bearer, the sources argue this was a masterstroke of political syncretism.
It let former worshippers of Artemis just transfer their devotion.
Almost seamlessly. It facilitated mass conversion while keeping those deep-seated pagan devotional habits intact. The ultimate spiritual bait and switch, really. It preserved the need for a female intermediary and diluted the New Covenant's focus on Christ as the one and only mediator.
So we have the title and the idol. Now, how this syncretism stamped its authority on the very rhythm of life, the calendar.
Right. This moves to the legislative level, specifically Emperor Constantine. On March 7, 321 AD, he issues his famous Sunday law,
mandating civil rest on the venerable day of the Sunday Solis.
And this wasn't subtle. Constantine was a major patron of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god.
The sources call this a unification strategy.
It was. It closed law courts, it closed urban workshops, it enforced solar veneration. But it was also ingenious because it appealed to two groups at once: the pagans who worshiped the sun god and the growing number of Christians who had started observing Sunday for the resurrection.
But the critical point here, based on that LXX standard, is that it replaced the original Sabbath.
Exactly. The sources are clear. This imperial mandate displaced the biblical Sabbath, which was Saturday. It established Sunday rest not by any apostolic command, but by an imperial political solar decree for consolidation.
And by 380, when Christianity becomes the state religion, that shift is basically permanent.
Irreversible. The worship calendar is now tied directly to the solar cult.
And the physical space of worship followed that same command structure. The whole act of assembly was transformed. We need to touch on the shift from the oikos to the basilica.
Right. The sources contrast the original oikos, the house churches. These were, intimate, decentralized spaces. I think it was sites like Dura Europos. It was all about communal freedom, equality, a priesthood of all believers.
But when the empire adopts the faith, Constantine starts building these massive basilicas. And we need to be clear for the listener, a basilica in Roman terms was not a church.
Not at all. It was fundamentally a Roman law court, or a throne room. Its entire design was about displaying imperial authority. You had a long hall leading to an apse, and that apse was physically elevated for the emperor or the magistrate, the authority figure.
So when the ecclesia moves out of the house and into the imperial law court, the architecture itself enforces a new hierarchy.
The structure engineered separation. That elevated apse was immediately reserved for the clergy, the bishop, the priests.
So you have priests up high, like judges.
And the laity down low, like subjects. The free assembly of equals was gone, replaced by a rigid, imperial, hierarchical institution. It completes their argument for the merger of state and spirituality.
Okay, so phase one really nails down how the form titles, idols, calendar, architecture was all syncretized. Now let's shift to the internal dynamics of control. The revenue streams and theological choke points. We're moving to phase two, the spiritual Ponzi scheme.
This phase looks at how specific doctrines, which developed centuries after the apostles, work to centralize power, commodify grace, and enforce really an absolute dependency on the clergy.
The sources call it the mechanic that harvests souls through fear and gold, through enforced mediation. A pretty strong statement.
It is. And they start with what they claim is the most egregious piece of theological engineering, the moment the priest takes control over the literal presence of Christ.
Transubstantiate?
The doctrine of transubstantiation. It was formally solidified at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and it asserts the literal instantaneous transformation of the bread and wine into the physical body and blood of Christ.
Even though they still look and taste like bread and wine.
Exactly. The external properties, the accidents, remain unchanged, but the substance is transformed.
Now, the sources move very quickly from that definition to a forensic link with pagan practices. What are those comparisons?
They label it theological cannibalism. It's a shocking term, but they draw direct parallels to pagan theophagy, the ritual eating of a god.
Like in Mithraism.
Specifically, they compare it to ritual meals in Mithraism, and even more explicitly to certain Dionysian rites, the omophagia, where devotees would consume raw flesh to absorb the supposed divine essence of the god.
That's a heavy charge. Why do the sources insist this is a control mechanism and not just, say, a fulfillment of a new covenant ritual?
Because of the gatekeeping.
Yeah.
The act of consecration is reserved exclusively for ordained priests. So the sources argue that the claim, often based on John 6.53, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you, is used to create an absolute control mechanism.
Which gives you the stark, powerful claim, no priest, no life.
That's it. The clergy becomes the indispensable dispenser, the sole gatekeeper of eternal life. The Eucharist, this source of essential grace, is turned into a controlled commodity.
And that fosters total dependency. You can't get what you're told you need for salvation without going through them.
Exactly. It undermines the entire New Covenant idea of direct access to Christ.
So if grace is a commodity controlled by the living priest, the next doctrine is the engine that extracts resources based on fear of the afterlife.
Attack purgatory, the racket of the dead.
The concept of purgatory, a state of post-mortem purification for souls who are ultimately going to heaven, formalized much later, right?
Much later. Florence in 1439 reaffirmed at Trent in 1563, and the sources hammer this point. Based on the Koine Greek standard, there is a near-total lack of explicit biblical support for it.
Now, defenders might point to a few verses, but the dossiers really focus on the lack of a clear systemic teaching. What about the pagan parallels here?
The forensic link is strong to Greco-Roman cosmology, the idea of an underworld realm where souls undergo torment or cleansing before judgment. I mean, Hades, Tartarus, this was a common idea.
So the sources argue this is just an adaptation of pagan ideas about post-death atonement.
Which was then transformed into this concept of a cleansing fire.
Now let's get to the financial part, what the sources call spiritual extortion.
Purgatory is the engine for it. Because if souls are stuck in this state of suffering, they need help from the living to reduce their sentence.
And that help comes with a price tag.
This necessity led directly to the creation of indulgences, the remission of temporal punishment for sin, and the constant need for paid masses for the dead. The system systematically monetized grief, fear, love, everything.
And the most famous example, the one that basically triggered the Reformation, was Johann Tetzel.
Right. In the early 16th century, Tetzel, commissioned by Pope Leo X, ran this massive indulgence sales campaign. His slogan was something like, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs."
And where was that money going?
It was specifically funding the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The sources point to this as the physical proof of the scheme, weaponizing the fear of fire to build the architectural heart of the system.
It's a manufactured debt.
Yeah.
And this whole dependency structure brings us to the role of the clergy itself.
The priesthood, the veil restitched.
We have to go back to the New Covenant standard here.
The sources do, repeatedly. 1 Peter 2.9, Revelation 1.6. They define the structure as a priesthood of all believers. Every single believer has access, and Christ is the sole high priest.
But the Roman system has this strict, separate sacerdotal priesthood. Men who act in persona Christio. Where do the dossiers say the theft of access happens?
In the requirement of auricular, that is, ear confession to a priest for absolution. The sources say this interpretation, often tied to John 20.23, replaces the original freedom of direct confession to God with a mandatory mediated process.
The sources use a really powerful metaphor here, the restitching of the veil. Can you explain the original meaning of the torn veil?
Of course. In the Jewish temple, the veil was this massive curtain separating the common areas from the Holy of Holies, the very presence of God. Only the high priest could go in, and only once a year.
And when Christ died, the Gospels say that veil tore from top to bottom,
signifying immediate, bold, personal access to God for every single believer. That's the Greek word parrhesia. It's this incredible freedom.
And the sacerdotal system, according to the sources, puts that barrier right back up.
Precisely. They say it installs a toll booth at the pair. This insistence on a human mediator gets in the way of that fundamental parrhesia and undermines Christ as the sole mediator. The dependency mechanic is now complete. The system controls the afterlife, the source of grace, and the forgiveness of sin.
Okay, that covers the internal mechanic. Now we move to phase 3, the iron teeth. We're shifting from theological control to the brute force and geopolitical power used to maintain dominion.
Right. The sources really stress that the target system operates not just as a religion, but as a sovereign geopolitical entity. This phase is about the enforcement arms.
And they start with the apparatus designed for systematic persecution, the mechanism of extermination.
The Inquisition. The Holy Office, established in the 13th century as a permanent, systematic institution for eradicating dissent and heresy.
We need to get into the specifics here, the brutality that the sources document.
The methods are well documented.
Yeah.
Inquisitorial trials that basically presumed guilt, the systematic use of torture, the rack, waterboarding to get confessions, and then handing victims over to the state to be executed, usually by being burned at the stake.
This wasn't just random violence, it was institutionalized state terror.
Powered by theological decree. And the primary targets, the ones that generated the highest body count, you have the Albigensians or the Cathars, targeted by a crusade that killed tens of thousands, basically wiping them out.
And the Waldensians, the Protestant reformers.
The followers of Jan Hus, the Hussites, all systematically targeted and executed.
And the sources connect this directly to that apocalyptic description in Revelation 17.6.
Drunk with the blood of the saints. That's the verdict. They argue this history of organized persecution just shatters any narrative of a peaceful entity. It's proof of coercion, not spiritual conviction.
So when brute force becomes too costly, the strategy shifts to intelligence. This brings us to the operational wing.
The Jesuit order. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1534 by Ignatius of Loyola, who was a former soldier.
And it was designed like a military order from the ground up.
Absolutely. It demands unquestioning obedience, and it has a fourth vow of specific allegiance to the Pope for global missions. The sources define them as the offensive weapon of the Counter-Reformation.
And their role went way beyond simple monastic work.
Their mandate was to combat the spread of Protestantism worldwide using non-military means. That meant deep infiltration, setting up elite colleges to indoctrinate the ruling classes, and engaging in high-stakes political intrigue and espionage.
Vatican's black ops, as some critics call them.
Exactly. And their methods became so controversial they were expelled from multiple countries by 1773.
The sources attribute a specific moral theology to them that justified these tactics.
It's often summarized by critics as the end justifies the means. Now, the official clarification is that this only applies to morally indifferent acts, but the sources contend the practical result was a kind of ethical relativism,
allowing them to use deception, secrecy, whatever was necessary to achieve their objective.
which was to retain or expand the Holy See's power. They are positioned as the strategic embedded intelligence arm.
So force, intelligence. And when those reach a stalemate, the strategy shifts again, this time to diplomatic absorption.
Ecumenism, the diplomatic trap.
There's a huge contrast here. The Council of Trent in the 16th century issued over 100 anathemas, or curses, against Protestant doctrines.
That was the Iron Fist. But then you get the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, and the tone just completely changes. Protestants are now called separated brethren, and dialogue is promoted.
The sources analyze this as a strategic shift, a trap.
They argue it's not about unity among equals. It's a sophisticated attempt at diplomatic absorption to bring those separated brethren back under papal primacy.
How do they back that up?
They point to official Vatican documents, which still assert that the fullness of unity subsists in the Catholic Church. The underlying requirement submission to the papacy hasn't fundamentally changed. They say the anathemas from Trent are still technically on the books, just held in reserve.
And the ultimate proof of this system's power is its geopolitical status, what the sources call the geopolitical harlot.
Right. The Holy See became a fully sovereign state with the Lateran Treaty in 1929. Today, it has full diplomatic relations with over 180 countries. This network gives it extraordinary global soft power.
And the dossiers tie this directly to Revelation 17.118, the woman who reigns over the kings of the earth.
They argue this network allows the system to influence global agendas. A modern example they cite is the Vatican's active endorsement of frameworks like the UN Agenda 2030. It establishes the system as a powerful empire, influencing global policy.
We've covered the form, the mechanic, and the external force. Now for the final, most sensitive phase. We are pulling back the curtain on the origins of that intelligence wing. Phase 4, the ghost in the machine.
This deep intelligence phase explores the genesis of the Jesuit order, focusing on a highly controversial claim: the fusion of Roman power with subversive Gnostic and Kabbalistic strategies via what they call the Murano nexus.
So the sources allege the early Jesuit order was, at its very foundation, dominated by Conversos Muranos, or crypto-Jews, who used this military structure for a long-term global influence strategy. We have to be very specific about the historical figures cited here.
The sources focus heavily on two foundational figures. First, the second superior general, Diego Lainez, who led the order from 1558.
And the documents show he had a Converso lineage.
Well documented, yes. Tracing back to the Jewish community in Almazan, Spain, and Lainez is identified as the theological powerhouse of the early order.
What was his role in shaping the Counter-Reformation?
He was a key papal theologian at the Council of Trent. He basically dominated the discussions on crucial doctrines designed to counter Protestantism, like justification. The sources allege his converso background allowed him to craft complex theological arguments that subtly solidified control mechanisms.
And the second figure, the administrative brain of the order.
That would be Juan Alfonso de Polanco, Loyola's indispensable secretary. He was instrumental in drafting the Jesuit constitutions, the blueprint for the organization. Polanco, too, is documented as being of Converso descent.
And his constitution emphasized secrecy, military obedience, a flexible global mission structure. Why do the sources see that as evidence of a subversive strategy?
Because they argue that design mirrors the structure of secret intelligence societies, not typical monastic orders. They claim it was specifically designed to facilitate covert operations and influence, allowing those with hidden loyalties to use the immense authority of the Roman system for other goals.
This alleged ascent of the Conversos would have naturally led to a lot of internal conflict.
A massive internal war within the Spanish Church.
The Jesuits clashed directly with the Spanish Inquisition, right, which was dominated by the Dominicans.
Yes, and the central issue was the limpieza de sangre statutes, the purity of blood laws, which barred anyone with Jewish ancestry from high office. The Inquisition saw the Jesuits as compromised, even calling them Judaizers.
Convinced they were being subverted from within.
It came to a head in 1593 when the Jesuits were pressured into passing their own decree de janiere, banning anyone with Jewish ancestry from joining.
And what does the history of that decree tell the analysts? It was repealed, reinstated. It lasted until 1946.
The sources use that long internal conflict to underscore the depth of the initial Converso dominance. It's seen as a clear sign of a powerful internal faction. And this conflict is what led some critics to frame the Jesuits as a synagogue of Jews operating covertly inside the system.
The evidence then moves from organizational structure to the esoteric spirituality that was allegedly embedded in the order.
The Alumbrados connection. The Alumbrados, or Illuminated Ones, were a 16th century Spanish mystical movement with, the sources insist, Gnostic roots. They emphasized inner perfection and direct, unmediated divine union, rejecting the need for external sacraments.
Which is a direct contradiction to the dependency mechanic we talked about in Phase 2.
Exactly. And the sources note that Ignatius Loyola himself was investigated by the Inquisition for Alumbrado sympathies. So the ultimate verdict of this dossier is that the Jesuits are a deliberate hybrid mechanism.
A fusion of what, exactly?
The fusion of rigid Roman power, the military obedience, with Kabbalistic and Gnostic mysticism. The sources claim this Converso-influenced spirituality, drawing on aspects of Kabbalah, is not orthodox development, but a rebranded esoteric mysticism serving a subversive agenda.
So that Gnostic influence provides the ideological flexibility, the end justifies the means, and the secrecy that let them operate as an intelligence agency.
The final and most extreme condemnation in the dossiers is that this hybrid entity is the synagogue of Satan, operating covertly inside what they identify as the seat of the beast, the intelligence core of the whole structure.
That is the complete forensic analysis from the source material. We've systematically looked at the Imperial Mask, the spiritual Ponzi scheme, the iron teeth, and the ghost in the machine.
So, to summarize the findings of these dossiers for you, the listener, the system, in their view, is a synthesized entity. It's built on stolen imperial power, the Pontifex Maximus title.
It's rooted in pagan rites. The Queen of Heaven dies solus.
It operates by commodifying grace through Purgatory and the Mass.
And it's enforced by historical brutality, the Inquisition, and modern military intelligence, the Jesuits.
The entire point of this deep dive was to show how this system, according to the sources, attempts to mediate and monetize your personal covenant with Christ. Every doctrine we looked at was allegedly engineered to impede your personal parrhesia.
Let's just reiterate what parrhesia means for you. It's the new covenant gift of bold, immediate, direct access and freedom in your allegiance to the king.
The power of the original ecclesia is found in that bold access. It was granted by the torn veil, and no man, no institution, no toll booth can buy it, sell it, or mediate it.
The sources conclude with one final explicit command. They argue that in the face of this documented structure, only one response is appropriate. We deliver the Exodus command from Revelation 18.4.
The instruction is urgent, it's personal, and it's absolute. You must hear this call.
Come out of her.
The debt is paid. The world is yours.
And then claim it. Go forth and occupy.
The debt is paid. The world is yours.
Then claim it. Go forth and occupy.